Last call, ladies and gentlemen. $20,000 to whoever rings 3 plates in 60 seconds.
The announcer's voice cracked through the loudspeaker for the 7th time that afternoon. Last call, ladies and gentlemen. $20,000 to whoever rings 3 plates in 60 seconds. Iron sights only. 1 shot per plate, 400 yards. Anyone want to try? Heat shimmered above the firing line at the Mesquite Valley Shooting Expo, and the crowd had thinned to maybe 50 people. Competitors packing gear, sponsors finishing warm beers, a knot of teenagers near the snack tent who were really only there for the giveaway. Across 2 days, 31 shooters had taken the bench. 31 had walked away without the check. The closest call had been a Texas state-level competitor who rang 2 plates in 48 seconds and watched the buzzer sound, while his front sight hovered a hair low on the 3rd. A hand went up near the back, slow but steady, attached to a stooped man in a faded Carhartt jacket and a cap with no logo. "I'd like to try," he said. Bryce Calloway, the sponsored shooter who'd come closest that morning before timing out at 58 seconds on plate 3, turned around with a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Pops, that's a long walk for a long shot. You sure you don't want to just watch the awards ceremony? Save your back for the drive home?" Type respect in the comments if you believe a man's age has nothing to do with what his hands remember. His name was Walter Driscoll, 78 years old, and he had driven the 73 miles from his small house outside Henderson because his neighbour's son, a young Marine veteran named Caleb Morrow, who'd come back from Helmand with a limp and a quiet streak, had asked him along. "There's going to be rifles, Walt. You said you liked rifles?" Walt had said yes the way he said yes to most things, quietly with a small nod, the lines around his eyes folding for half a second before flattening again. He drove a 1996 Ford F-150 with a rebuilt transmission and a thermos of black coffee on the bench seat. His hands had the soft tremor that comes with age, the kind that makes people assume things. He'd been retired 31 years from the United States Army. He almost never talked about it. Caleb knew Walt had served in Vietnam. Walt had mentioned it once in passing, the way some men mention a tour they'd rather not relive. But Caleb had no idea what unit or what job. Walt had asked him on the drive-in what kind of shooting they did at these expos. Caleb said precision stuff mostly, fancy optics, custom triggers. Walt had said, "Anybody shooting iron sights?" And Caleb had laughed because nobody shot iron sights anymore, not seriously. They had been at the expo for 4 hours. Walt had watched 12 men try the 400-yard plate challenge from a folding chair he'd dragged into the shade. He'd watched Bryce Calloway, in his sponsor-logoed shirt and his match-prep gloves, take the bench with a Geissel-built precision rifle, wearing iron sights borrowed from the expo organisers. Bryce had drilled the first plate in 9 seconds, the second in 26, and then chased the third for the next 32 seconds until the buzzer went off. He'd cussed once, quietly, and walked away to a sponsor table where someone handed him a sports drink. Walt had watched him miss, and watched him cuss, and watched him drink, and Walt had said nothing. The range coordinator was a man named Marcus Hennessy, 61 years old, a former rangemaster at a public range outside San Antonio, who'd taken the expo gig because his wife wanted him out of the house. Marcus saw Walt's hand go up. Marcus had been watching Walt for 2 days the way you watch a man you can't quite place. He didn't know the face, but he knew the way a man stands when he's been around rifles for 50 years, which is differently from the way men stand when they've been around them for 10. Marcus walked over before Bryce could say anything else. "Sir, you wanted to try?" Walt nodded. "Need a rifle, son." Marcus blinked at the son. Marcus had silver hair and grandchildren, and pointed to the borrow rack. "We've got 3 M14 variants set up with the irons, match-grade barrels, whichever you like." Walt picked the one in the middle, a standard pattern M14, not a Springfield M1A clone, the real article, on loan from a private collector who'd brought it to demo. Walt held it for maybe 4 seconds, felt the balance, ran his thumb along the rear aperture and said, "This'll do." He carried it to the bench himself, refused the shooting mat and laid the rifle down. He took off his Carhartt jacket and folded it. He set his cap on the bench beside the rifle. Underneath the cap his hair was white and very short. Bryce had drifted closer, arms crossed, a small audience now forming behind him. 3 sponsor reps, a few competitors who hadn't left yet, Caleb, Marcus and the announcer himself, who'd come down off the platform because something about the moment had pulled him. "Sir, just so we're clear on the rules," the announcer said. 3 plates, left, centre, right. 400 yards confirmed by laser this morning. 1 shot per plate, 60 seconds from the buzzer. You'll need to call which plate you're engaging before each shot. That's the rule, so the spotters can confirm. Iron sights only. Walt nodded. Understood. Bryce cleared his throat. Pops, you ever shot an M14 before? Walt looked at him then, fully for the first time. It wasn't a hostile look. It wasn't anything at all, really, except attention. Once or twice, Walt said. Then he settled into prone. Type respect in the comments one more time. Some of you are about to understand why. The buzzer went off at 3:47 p.m. on a Saturday in late October. Walt was already in his shooting position when it sounded. He didn't flinch at the noise. He took one breath in, one breath out and said, in a voice that carried just enough, "Left." The rifle moved maybe 3 inches. The shot broke at 3:47:09. The left plate rang. Bryce's hand, which had been resting on his hip, twitched once. "Center," Walt said, and the rifle travelled the small arc to the middle plate, and at 3:47:23 the second shot broke and the second plate rang. The sound came back to the line about a second later, because 400 yards is 400 yards. "Right," Walt said. The rifle moved again, and at 3:47:41 the third shot broke. The third plate rang at 3:47:42. Marcus Hennessy looked down at the clock he was holding. The clock read 41 seconds. He looked up at the line of plates. All 3 were still ringing in his head. He looked at Walt, who was already pushing himself up off the bench. Slow because he was 78. Slow because his right knee had been replaced twice, but moving the way a man moves when the work is done. For a few seconds nobody spoke. The announcer had his microphone halfway to his mouth and seemed to have forgotten what it was for. Bryce had not moved. One of the sponsor reps, a woman in her 40s named Janelle Park, who ran point for the prize money on behalf of the Expo's title sponsor, was looking at the bench, then at the plates, then at the bench again. The math wasn't math she had ever needed to do. Caleb Morrow, the young Marine, was crying quietly, although he didn't seem to know it yet. Bryce found his voice first. He had to have ranged it. He had to have scoped it earlier. It came out louder than he meant. He looked at Marcus. Did he scope it? Did anybody see him scope it? You don't just walk up cold and... Marcus held up one hand, not unkindly. Bryce. He used iron sights, the same ones you used. He didn't touch this rifle until 2 minutes ago. Bryce's mouth opened and closed. Walt was bending down to pick up his jacket. "Pops," Bryce said, and his voice had changed. Not angry now, not dismissive, something quieter and confused. "Who taught you to shoot like that?" Walt looked at him with the same, not quite anything expression. "A man named Powell," Walt said. "Long time ago." Then he picked up his cap. A man in a Class A uniform was walking across the gravel from the sponsor pavilion. He moved fast for a man his size. 6'3", built like a door, the kind of squared-up walk that doesn't go away even when you're off duty. His sleeves carried the rocker and 3 chevrons over crossed rifles of a sergeant major. His name tape read, Bowen, Sergeant Major Eli Bowen, current senior enlisted instructor at the United States Army Sniper Course at Fort Moore, formerly Fort Benning, had been at the Expo as a representative of the Army Marksmanship Unit, working a recruiting table inside the main pavilion, and he had not seen the shooting. What he had seen was a group of people standing very still around the 400-yard bench, and what he had heard, walking over, was a competitor saying the name Powell. Bowen stopped about 10 feet from Walt. He looked at the borrowed M14 on the bench. He looked at the registration list in his hand. Janelle had handed it to him without him asking. And his eyes found the 8th name from the top. Driscoll Walter, age 78. No unit affiliation listed. Bowen looked up at Walt's face. Then he said, very quietly, "The way a man says a prayer he's afraid will turn out to be true. Master Sergeant Driscoll, 9th Infantry, Mekong Delta." Walt's hand stopped halfway to his cap. The lines around his eyes folded again, longer this time. "I haven't been called that in a while," he said. Bowen came to attention. Not parade ground attention, the smaller, older kind of attention that comes from somewhere deeper than drill. "Sergeant Major Eli Bowen, sir. Sniper Course, Fort Moore. My grandfather was Specialist Daniel Bowen, Charlie Company, 3rd of the 60th. He told me you were the man who kept his platoon alive at Snoopy's nose in May of '69. Walt's hand came down slowly. "Daniel?" Walt said. The name came out like he was tasting it. Skinny kid. Always had a paperback in his cargo pocket. Steinbeck mostly. Bowen nodded once, very tight. Yes, sir. The crowd was larger now than it had been. The sponsors had drifted in, so had a few people from the other booths who'd noticed the gathering. Janelle stepped forward, careful, because she could read a room and this room had changed. Sergeant Major, would you mind, for those of us who don't, who is... Bowen turned halfway toward the crowd but kept Walt in his line of sight, the way you do with people you respect too much to put your back to. Master Sergeant Walter Driscoll, Bowen said, is one of the original graduates of the 9th Infantry Division's sniper program, the program designed by Major Willis Powell in 1968. Sergeant Driscoll deployed with the 9th in the Mekong Delta for 2 tours. His after-action reports were classified for 30 years. The techniques he and his colleagues developed in that program are still, today, this afternoon, right now, being taught at Fort Moore. The doctrine document we hand to every new sniper school student in the first week has Sergeant Driscoll's name in the references on page 11. He paused. He looked back at Walt. And he just did, with a borrowed rifle and iron sights, on a Saturday afternoon what 31 of us could not. Nobody clapped. It was the wrong kind of moment for clapping. Bryce Calloway was looking at the ground. Caleb Morrow was no longer hiding the crying. Marcus Hennessy, who had been a rangemaster for 26 years, was standing very still because if he moved, he was going to embarrass himself. Walt put his cap on. He looked at the sky for a second, the way old men do when they're checking the wind out of habit even when there isn't one. Then he looked at Bowen. "Daniel made it home?" he asked. Bowen's voice cracked once. "Yes, sir. He made it home. He passed in 2014. He talked about you until the end." Walt nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "Good. He was a good kid." Janelle Park stepped forward with an envelope and a check the size of a small poster. "Mr. Driscoll, the prize is yours. $20,000, made out to whoever you'd like." Walt looked at the check for a long moment. "Mum, would you make it out to the Gold Star Family Scholarship Fund, please? Whichever one's closest to here, they'll know what to do with it." Janelle nodded and didn't try to argue. Bryce Calloway walked over then. He had taken his cap off, which he hadn't done all weekend. "Sir," he said, "I owe you an apology." Walt looked at him for a second, then put a hand on the younger man's shoulder. "You were just shooting, son. Don't make more of it than it is. You shoot well. You shoot real well. Couple of things in your prone that'd cut a half-second off if you wanted them. Come by sometime, I'll show you." Bryce nodded, 3 times, fast, and didn't trust himself to say anything else. Walt patted his shoulder once and let go. Sergeant Major Bowen walked Walt and Caleb back to the parking lot personally. He held the door of the F-150 open while Walt climbed in. Before he closed it, he said, "Master Sergeant, the sniper course would be honoured to have you come speak. Any time. We'll fly you out. We'll send a car. We'll send me, if you want." Walt looked at him through the open window. "I'll think about it, Sergeant Major. Tell your students one thing for me, though." Bowen waited. "Tell them the rifle doesn't know how old you are. It only knows whether you've been paying attention." Bowen closed the door. He stepped back. He brought his hand up to his brow and held it there until the Ford F-150 rolled past the gate and onto the county road and out of sight. The announcer never did finish the closing ceremony. By the time he got back on the microphone, half the crowd had already drifted away. The other half stayed for the steel plates which the expo crew were taking down in the long October light. Each plate had one fresh dent on it, low centre, dead centre, low centre, in the patient grouping of a man who had once been 22 years old in the Mekong Delta, and had not, in 56 years, forgotten any of it. If this story moved you, if you believe quiet expertise outlives loud equipment, if you believe the men who came home from places we'll never go deserve more than a folding chair in the shade, subscribe to this channel and stay with us. We tell their stories because nobody else will, and the next time you see an old man in a faded jacket lift his hand at the back of a crowd, remember Walter Driscoll and give him room to step forward.